All right. So we're ready to pick up with volume 2 of Persuasion. I wish I'd realized there was 2 volumes to begin with. I would have not just been saying chapters for that whole first volume, but you know what? That's where we are. Okay. And hopefully I'm able to stay awake because I stayed up way too late last night. So we'll see how that affects me today. Okay. Chapter 1. The remainder of Anne's time at Upper Cross, comprehending only 2 days, was spent entirely at the mansion house. She had the satisfaction of knowing herself extremely useful there, both as an immediate companion and as assisting in all those arrangements for the future, which, in Mr. and Mrs. Musgrove's distressed state of spirits, would have been difficulties. They had an earlier account from Lyme the next morning. Louisa was very much the same. No symptoms worse than before had appeared. Charles came a few hours afterwards to bring a later and more particular account. He was tolerably cheerful. A speedy cure must not be hoped, but everything was going on as well as the nature of the case admitted. In speaking of the Harvilles, he seemed unable to satisfy his own sense of their kindness, especially of Mrs. Harville's exertions as a nurse. She really left nothing for Mary to do. He and Mary had been persuaded to go early to their inn last night. Mary had been hysterical again this morning. When he came away, she was going to walk out with Captain Benwick, which, he hoped, would do her good. He almost wished she had been prevailed on to come home the day before, but the truth was that Mrs. Harville left nothing for anybody to do. Charles was to return to Lyme the same afternoon, and his father had at first half a mind to go with them, but the ladies could not consent. It would be going only to multiply trouble to the others and increase his own distress. And a much better scheme followed and was acted upon. A chaise was sent for from Creekern. From Creekern, and Charles conveyed back a far more useful person in the old nursery maid of the family, one who, having brought up all the children, had seen the very last, and the lingering and long-petted Master Harry, sent to school after his brothers, was now living in her deserted nursery to mend stockings, and dress all the blains and bruises she could get near her, and who, consequently, was only too happy in being allowed to go and help nurse dear Miss Louisa. Vague wishes of getting Sarah thither had occurred before to Mrs. Musgrove and Henrietta, but without Anne, it would have hardly been resolved on and found practicable so soon. They were indebted the next day to Charles Hayter for all the minute knowledge of Louisa, which had been so essential to obtain every 24 hours. He made it his business to go to Lyme, and his account was still encouraging. The intervals of sense and consciousness were believed to be stronger. Every report agreed in Captain Wentworth's appearing fixed in Lyme, and was to leave them on the morrow, an event which they all dreaded. What should they do without her? They were wretched comforters for one another. And so much was said in this way that Anne thought she could do no better than that Anne thought she could do no better than impart among them the general inclination to which she was privy, and persuade them all to go to Lyme at once. She had little difficulty. It was soon determined that they should It was soon determined that they would go tomorrow, fix themselves at the inn, or get into lodgings, as it suited, and there remain till dear Louisa could be moved. They must be taking off some trouble from the good people she was with. They might at least relieve Mrs. Harville from the care of her own children, and in short, they were so happy in the decision that Anne was delighted with what she had done, and felt that she could not spend her last morning at Uppercross better than assisting the preparations, and setting them off at an early hour, though her being left to the solitary range of the house was the consequence. She was the last. She was the last, excepting the little boys of the cottage. She was the very last, the only remaining one of all that had filled the only one remaining the only remaining one of all that had filled and animated both houses, of all that had given Uppercross its cheerful character. A few days had made a change indeed. If Louisa recovered, it would be all well again. More, more than former happiness would be restored. There could be no There could not be a doubt, to her mind there was none, of what would follow her recovery. A few months since, and the room now so deserted, occupied but by her silent, pensive self, might be filled again with all that was happy and gay, all that was glowing and bright and prosperous love, all that was most unlike Anne Elliot. An hour's complete leisure for such reflections as these, on a dark November day, a small thick rain almost blotting out the very few objects ever to be discerned from the windows, was enough to make the sound of Lady Russell's carriage exceedingly welcome, and yet, though desirous to be gone, she could not quit the mansion house, or look in adieu to the cottage, with its black, dripping, and comfortless veranda, or even notice through the misty glasses the last humble tenements of the village, without a saddened heart. Scenes had passed in Uppercross, which made it precious. It stood the record of many sensations of pain, once severe, but now softened, and of some instances of relenting feeling, some breathings of friendship and reconciliation which could never be looked for again, and which could never cease to be dear. She left it all behind her, all but the recollection that such things had been. Anne had never entered Kellynch since her quitting Lady Russell's house in September. It had not been necessary, in the few occasions of it being possible for her to go to the hall, she had contrived to evade and escape from. Her first return was to resume her place in the modern and elegant apartments of the lodge, and there to gladden the eyes of its mistress. There was some anxiety mixed with Lady Russell's joy in meeting her. She knew who had been frequenting Uppercross, but happily, either Anne was improved in plumpness and looks, or Lady Russell fancied her so, and Anne, in receiving her compliments on the occasion, had the amusement of connecting them with the silent admiration of her cousin, and of hoping that she was to be blessed with a second spring of youth and beauty. When they came to converse, she was soon sensible of some mental change. The subjects on which her heart had been full on leaving Kellynch, and which she had felt slighted, and been compelled to smother among the Musgroves, were now become of secondary interest. She had lately lost sight even of her father and sister in Bath. Their concerns had been sunk under those of Uppercross, and when Lady Russell reverted to their former hopes and fears, and spoke her satisfaction in the house of Camden Place, which had been taken, and her regret that Mrs. Clay should still be with them, Anne, who would have been ashamed to have known and would have been ashamed to have it known how much more she was thinking of Lyme and Louisa Musgrove and all her acquaintance there. How much more interesting to her was the home and the friendship of the Harvilles and Captain Benwick than her own father's house in Camden Place, or her own sister's intimacy with Mrs. Clay. She was actually forced to exert herself to meet Lady Russell with anything like the appearance of equal solicitude on topics which by nature the first claim on topics which by nature had the first claim on her. There was a little awkwardness at first in their discourse on another subject. They must speak of the accident at Lyme. Lady Russell had not been arrived 5 minutes the day before when a full account of the whole had burst on her. But still it must be talked of. She must make inquiries. She must regret the imprudence, lament the result, and Captain Wentworth's name must be mentioned by both. Anne was conscious of not doing it so well as Lady Russell. She could not speak the name, and look straight forward to Lady Russell's eye, till she had adopted the expedient of telling her briefly what she had thought of the attachment between him and Louisa. When this was told, his name distressed her no longer. Lady Russell had only to listen composedly and wish them happy, but internally her heart reveled in angry pleasure and pleased contempt that the man who at 23 had seemed to understand somewhat of the value of an Anne Elliot should, 8 years afterwards, be charmed by a Louisa Musgrove. The first 3 or 4 days passed most quietly, with no circumstance to mark them, excepting the receipt of a note or two from Lyme, which found their way to Anne. She could not tell how, and brought a rather improving account of Louisa. At the end of that period, Lady Russell's politeness could repose no longer, and the fainter self-threatenings of the past became in a decided tone. I must call on Mrs. Croft. I really must call upon her soon. Anne, have you the courage to go with me and pay a visit in that house? It will be some trial to us both. Anne did not shrink from it. On the contrary, she truly felt as she said in observing, I think you are very likely to suffer the most of the two. Your feelings are less reconciled to the change than mine. By remaining in the neighborhood, I am become inured to it. She could have said more on the subject, for she had in fact so high an opinion of the Crofts, and considered her father so very fortunate in his tenants, felt the parish to be so sure of a good example, and the poor of the best attention and relief, that however sorry and ashamed for the necessity of the removal, she cannot but in conscience feel that they were gone who deserved not to stay. That Kellynch Hall had passed into better hands than its owners. These convictions must unquestionably have their own pain, and severe was its kind, but they precluded that pain which Lady Russell would suffer in entering the house again, and returning through the well-known apartments. In such moments, Anne had no power of saying to herself, these rooms ought to belong only to us. Oh, how fallen in their destination! How unworthily occupied! An ancient family to be so driven away, strangers filling their place? No, except when she thought of her mother, she remembered where she had been used. Except when she thought of her mother, and remembered where she had been used to sit and preside. She had no sigh of that description to heave. Mrs. Croft always met her with a kindness which gave her the pleasure of fancying herself Mrs. Croft Mrs. Croft always met her with a kindness which gave her the pleasure of fancying herself as a favorite. No, as. Which gave her the pleasure of fancying herself a favorite, and on the present occasion, receiving her in that house, there was a particular attention. The sad accident at Lyme was soon the prevailing topic, and on comparing their latest accounts of the invalid, it appeared that each lady dated her intelligence on the same it appeared that each lady dated her intelligence from the same hour of yestermorn. The Captain Wentworth had been in Kellynch yesterday, the first time since the accident, had brought Anne the last note, which she had not been able to trace the exact steps of, had stayed a few hours, and then returned again to Lyme, and without any present intention of quitting it any more. He had inquired after her, she found, particularly. He expressed his hope of Miss Elliot's not being the worse for her exertions, and had spoken of those exertions as great. This was handsome, and gave her more pleasure than almost anything else could have done. As to the sad catastrophe itself, it could be canvassed. We'll try canvassed. As to the sad catastrophe itself, it could be canvassed only in one style by a couple of steady, sensible women whose judgments had to work on ascertained events, and it was perfectly decided that it had been the consequence of much thoughtlessness and much imprudence, that its efforts were most alarming, and that it was frightful to think how long Miss Musgrove's recovery might yet be doubtful, and how liable she would be still, and how liable she would still remain to suffer from the concussion hereafter. The Admiral wound it all up summarily by exclaiming, "Aye, a very bad business indeed. A new sort of way this, for a young fellow to be making love by breaking his mistress's head is okay. Aye, a very bad business indeed. A new sort of way this, for a young fellow to be making love by breaking his mistress's head, is not it, Miss Elliot? This is breaking a head and gaining. This is breaking a head and giving a plaister truly." Admiral Croft's manners were not quite of the tone to suit Lady Russell, but they delighted Anne. Her goodness of heart and simplicity of character were irresistible. "Now this must be very bad for you," said he, suddenly rousing from a little reverie, "to be coming and finding us here. I had not recollected it before, I declare, but it must be very bad. But now, do not stand upon ceremony. Get up and go over all the rooms in the house if you like it." "Another time, sir, I thank you. Not now." "Well, whenever it suits you. You can slip in from the shrubbery at any time. There you will find we keep our umbrellas hanging up by that door. A good place, is not it? But," checking himself, "you will not think it a good place, for yours were always kept in the butler's room. Aye, so it always is, I believe. One man's way may be as good as another's, but we all like our own best. And so you must judge for yourself whether it would be better for you to go about the house or not." Anne, finding she might decline it, did so, very gratefully. "We have made very few changes either," continued the Admiral, after thinking a moment. "Very few. We told you about the laundry door at Uppercross. That has been a very great improvement. The wonder was how any family upon earth could bear the inconvenience of its opening as it did so long. You will tell Sir Walter what we have done, and that Mr. Shepherd thinks it is the greatest improvement the house ever had. Indeed, I must do ourselves the justice to say that the few alterations we have made have been all the very much for the better. My wife should have the credit of them, however. I have done very little, besides sending away some of the large-looking glass. I have done very little besides sending away some of the large looking glasses from my dressing room, which were your father's. A very good man, and very much the gentleman, I am sure, But I should think, Miss Elliot, looking with serious reflection, I should think he must be a rather I should think he must be rather a dressy man for his time of life. Such a number of looking glasses. Oh Lord, there was no getting away from oneself. So I got Sophie to lend me a hand, and we soon shifted their quarters, and now I'm quite snug, with my little shaving glass in one corner, and another great thing that I never go near. Anne, amused in spite of herself, was rather distressed for an answer, and the Admiral, fearing he may have not been civil enough, took up the subject again to say, "The next time you write to your good father, Miss Elliot, pray give my compliments and Mrs. Crofts, and say that we are settled here quite to our liking, and have no fault at all to find with the place. The breakfast room chimney smokes a little, I grant you, but it is only when the wind is due north and blows hard, which may not happen 3 times a winter. And take it altogether, now that we have been in now that we have been into most of the houses hereabouts and can judge, that there is not one that we like better than this. Pray say so, with my compliments. He'll be glad to hear it." Lady Russell and Mrs. Croft were very well pleased with each other, but the acquaintance which this visit began was fated not to proceed at far at present. For when it returned, the Crofts announced themselves to be going away for a few weeks, to visit their connections in the north of the country, and probably might not be at home again before Lady Russell would be removing to Bath. So ended all danger to Anne of meeting Captain Wentworth at Kellynch Hall, or of seeing him in company with her friend. Everything was safe enough, and she smiled over the many anxious feelings she had wasted on the subject. So where's the twist going to come from now? There we go. That was a relatively short chapter. I might have time for 3 of those if they're all that short. In fact, I think I will. Okay, cool. I haven't had a 3-chapter day in a while. Chapter 2. Get comfy. Though Charles and Mary had remained at Lyme much longer after Mr. and Mrs. Musgrove's going, than Anne conceived that they could have been at all wanted, they were yet the first of their family to be at home again, and as soon as possible after the return and as soon as possible after the return and as soon as possible after the and as soon as possible after the return to Uppercross, they drove over to the lodge. They had left Louisa beginning to sit up, but her head, though clear, was exceedingly weak, and her nerves susceptible to the highest extreme of tenderness, and though she might be pronounced to be altogether doing very well, it was still impossible to say when she might be able to bear the removal home. And her father and mother, who must return in time to receive their younger children for the Christmas holidays, had hardly a hope of being allowed to bring her with them. They had been in all lodgings together. Mrs. Musgrove had got Mrs. Harville's children away as much as she could. Every possible supply from Uppercross had been furnished to lighten the inconvenience to the Harvilles. Well, the Harvilles had been wanting them to come to dinner every day, and in short, it seemed only to have been a struggle. It seemed to have been only a struggle on each side as to which should be the most. It seemed to have been only a struggle on each side as to which should be most disinterested and hospitable. Mary had her evils, but upon the whole, as was evident by her staying so long, she had found no, she had found more to enjoy than to suffer. Charles Hayter had been at Lyme oftener. Charles Hayter had been at Lyme oftener than suited her, and when they dined with the Harvilles there had been only a maidservant to wait, and at first Mrs. Harville had always given Mrs. Harville had always given Mrs. Musgrove precedence, but then she had received so she had received so very handsome an apology from her on finding out whose daughter she was, and there had been so much going on every day. There had been so many walks between their lodgings and the Harvilles that she had got books from the library and changed them so often that the balance had certainly become much in favor of Lyme. She had been taken to she had been taken to Charmouth too, and she had bathed, and she had gone to church, and there were a great many more people to look at in the church at Lyme. And there were a great many more people to look at the church in Lyme. And there were a great many more people to look at in the church at Lyme than at Uppercross. And all this, joined to the sense of being so very useful, had made really an agreeable fortnight. Anne inquired after Captain Benwick. Mary's face was clouded directly. Charles laughed. "Oh, Captain Benwick is very well, I believe, but he is a very odd young man. I do not know what he would be at. We asked him to come home with us for a day or two. Charles undertook. Oh, this is Mary's line. Oh, Captain Benwick is very well, I believe, but he is a very odd young man. I do not know where he would be at. I do not know what he would be at. We asked him to come home with us for a day or two. Charles undertook to give him some shooting, and he seemed quite delighted, and for my part, I thought it was all settled, when behold, on Tuesday night, he made a very awkward sort of excuse. He never shot, and he had been quite misunderstood. And he had promised this, and he had promised that, and that was the end of it. And the end of it was, I found, that he did not mean to come. I suppose he was afraid of finding it dull, but upon my word, I should have thought we were lively enough at the cottage for such a heartbroken man as Captain Benwick. Charles laughed again and said, Now, Mary, you know very well how it really was. It was all your doing. Turning to Anne, he fancied that if he went with us, he should find you close by. He fancied everybody to be living in Uppercross, and when he discovered that Lady Russell lived 3 miles off, his heart failed him, and he had not courage to come. That is the fact, upon my honor. Mary knows it is. Mary knows it is. But Mary did not give in to it very graciously, whether from not considering Captain Benwick entitled by birth and situation to be in love with an Elliot, or from not wanting to believe Anne a greater attraction to Uppercross than herself, must be left to be guessed. But Mary did not give in to it very graciously, whether from not considering Captain Benwick entitled by birth and situation to be in love with an Elliot, or from not wanting to believe Anne a greater attraction to Uppercross than herself, must be left to be guessed. Anne's goodwill, however, was not to be lessened by what she heard. She boldly acknowledged herself flattered, and continued her inquiries. "Oh, he talks of you," cried Charles, "in such terms." Mary interrupted him. "I declare, Charles, I never heard him mention Anne twice all the time I was there. I declare, Anne, he never talks of you at all." "No," admitted Charles. "I do not know that he ever does, in a general way. But, however, it is a very clear thing that he admires you exceedingly. His head is full of some books that he is reading upon your recommendation, and he wants to talk to you about them, and has found out something or other in one of them which he thinks, oh, I cannot pretend to remember I cannot pretend to remember it, but it was something very fine. I overheard him telling Henrietta all about it, and then Miss Elliot was spoken of in the highest terms. Now, Mary, I declare it was so. I heard it myself, and you were in the other room. Elegance, sweetness, beauty. Oh, there was no end of Miss Elliot's charms. And I am sure, cried Mary warmly, it was so very little to his credit if he did. Miss Harville only died last June. Such a heart is very such a heart is very little worth having, is it, Lady Russell? I am sure you will agree with I am sure you will agree with me. I must see I must see Captain Benwick before I decide, said Lady Russell, smiling. And that you are very likely to do very soon. I can tell you, ma'am, said Charles. Though he had not nerves for coming away with us and setting off again afterwards to pay a formal visit here, he will make his way over to Kellynch one day by himself. You may depend on it. I told him the distance and the road, and I told him of the churches being so very well worth seeing, for as he has a taste of those sorts of things, I thought that would be a good excuse. And he listened with all understanding and soul, and I am sure from his manner that you will have him calling here soon. So I give you notice, Lady Russell. Any acquaintance of Anne, any acquaintance of Anne's will always be welcome to me, was Lady Russell's kind answer. Oh, as to being Anne's acquaintance, said Mary, I think he is rather my acquaintance, for I have been seeing him every day this last fortnight. Well, as your joint acquaintance, then, I shall be very happy to see Captain Benwick. You will not find You will not find anything very agreeable in him, I assure you, ma'am. He is one of the dullest young men that ever lived. He has walked with me sometimes from one end of the sands to the other without saying a word. He is not at all a well-bred young man. I am sure you will not like him. There we differ, Mary, said Anne. I think Lady Russell would like him. I think she very I think she would be pleased I think she would be so much pleased with his mind that she would very soon see no deficiency in his manner. So do I, Anne, said Charles. I am sure Lady Russell would like him. He is just Lady Russell's sort. Give him a book, and he will read all day long. Yes, that he will, exclaimed Mary tauntingly. He will sit poring over his book and not know when a person speaks to him, or when one drops one's scissors, or anything that happens. Do you think Lady Russell would like that? Lady Russell could not help Lady Russell could not help laughing. Upon my word, said she, I could not have I could not have supposed that my opinion of anyone could have emitted I could not have supposed that my opinion of anyone could have admitted of such difference of conjecture, steady and matter of fact as I call myself. I have really a curiosity to see the person who can give occasion to such directly opposed notions. I wish he may be inclined to call here. And when he does, Mary, you may depend upon hearing my opinion, but I am determined not to judge him beforehand. You will not like him, I will answer for it. You will not like him, I will answer for it. Lady Russell began to talk. Lady Russell began talking of something else. Mary spoke with animation of their meeting with, or rather missing, Mr. Elliot so extraordinarily. He is a man, said Lady Russell, whom I have no wish to see. His declining to be on cordial terms with the head of his family has left a very strong impression in his disfavor with me. This decision checked Mary's eagerness, and stopped her short in the midst of the Elliot countenance. With regards to Captain Wentworth, though Anne hazarded no inquiries, there was voluntarily communication sufficient. Let me try that one again. With regard to Captain Wentworth, though Anne hazarded no inquiries, there was voluntarily communication sufficient. His spirits had been greatly improved lately. His spirits had been greatly recovering lately, as might be expected. As Louisa improved, he had improved, and he was now quite a different creature from what he had been the first week. And he was now quite a different creature from what he had been the first week. He had not seen Louisa, and was so extremely fearful of any ill consequence to her from an interview that he did not press for it at all, and on the contrary, seemed to have a plan of going away for a week or 10 days, till her head were stronger. He had talked of going down to Plymouth for a week, and wanted to persuade Captain Benwick to go with him, but as Charles maintained to the last, Captain Benwick seemed much more disposed to ride over to Kellynch. There could be no doubt that Lady Russell and Anne were both occasionally thinking of Captain Benwick from this time. Lady Russell could not hear the doorbell without feeling that it might be his herald, nor could Anne return from any stroll of solitary indulgence in her father's grounds, or any visit of charity in the village, without wondering whether she might see him or hear of him. Captain Benwick came not, however. He was either less disposed for it than Charles had imagined, or else he was too shy. After giving him a week's indulgence, Lady Russell determined to be unworthy of the interest which he had been given to excite. The Musgroves came back to receive their happy boys and girls from school, bringing with them Mrs. Harville's little children, to improve the noise of Uppercross and lessen that of Lyme. Henrietta remained with Louisa, but all the rest of the family were again in their usual quarters. Lady Russell and Anne paid their compliments to them once, when Anne could not but feel that Uppercross was already quite alive again, though neither Henrietta nor Louisa nor Charles hated her. Nor Charles Hayter, nor Captain Wentworth were there, the room presented a strong contrast as strong a contrast as could be wished to the last stage she had seen it in. Immediately surrounding Mrs. Musgrove were the little Harvilles, whom she had sedulously. I'll try sedulously. Immediately surrounding Mrs. Musgrove were the little Harvilles, whom she was sedulously guarding from the tyranny of the two children from the cottage, expressly arrived to amuse them. On one side was a table, occupied by some chattering girls, cutting up silk and gold paper, and on the other were trestles and trays, bending under the weight of brawn and cold pies, where riotous boys were holding high revel, the whole completed by a roaring Christmas fire, which seemed determined to be heard, in spite of all the noise of the others. Charles and Mary also came in, of course, during their visit. And Mr. Musgrove made a point of paying respects to Lady Russell, and sat down close to her for 10 minutes, talking with a very raised voice, but from the clamor of the children on his knees, generally in vain. It was a fine family peace. Anne, judging from her own temperament, would have deemed such a domestic hurricane a bad restorative of the nerves, which Louisa's illness must have so greatly shaken. But Mrs. Musgrove, who got Anne near her on purpose to thank her most cordially, again and again, for all her attentions to them, concluded a short recapitulation of what she had suffered herself by observing, with a happy glance around the room, that after all she had gone through, nothing was so likely to do her good as a little quiet cheerfulness at home. Louisa was now recovering apace. Her mother could even think of her being able to join their party at home before her brothers and sisters went to school again. The Harvilles had promised to come with her and stay at Uppercross whenever she returned. Captain Wentworth was gone, for the present, to see his brother in Shropshire. I'll try Shropshire. Captain Wentworth was gone, for the present, to see his brother in Shropshire. I hope I shall remember in future, said Lady Russell, as soon as they were reseated in the carriage, not to call at Uppercross in the Christmas holidays. Not to call at Uppercross in the Christmas holidays. Everybody had their taste in noise. Everybody had their taste in noises, as well as in other matters, and sounds are quite innocuous, or most distressing, by their sort rather than their quantity. When Lady Russell, not long afterwards, was entering Bath on a wet afternoon and driving through the long course of streets from the old bridge to Camden Place, amidst the dash of other carriages, the heavy rumble of carts and drays, the bawling of newsmen, muffinmen, and milkmen, and the ceaseless clink of pattens, she made no complaint. No, these were noises which belonged to the winter pleasures. Her spirits rose under their influence, and like Mrs. Musgrove, she was feeling, though not saying, that after being long in the country, nothing could be so good for her as a little quiet cheerfulness. Anne did not share these feelings. She persisted in a very determined, though very silent, disinclination for Bath, caught the first in view of the extensive buildings, smoking and rain, without any wish of seeing them better, felt her progress through the streets to be, however disagreeable, yet too rapid, for who would be glad to see her when she arrived, and looked back with fond regret to the bustles of Uppercross and the seclusion of Kellynch. Elizabeth's last letter had communicated a piece of news of some interest. Mr. Elliot was in Bath. He had called in Camden Place, had called a second time, a third, had been pointedly attentive. If Elizabeth and her father did not deceive themselves, had been taking as much pains to seek their acquaintance and proclaim the value of the connection as he had formerly taken pains to show neglect. This was very wonderful if it were true, and Lady Russell was in a state of very agreeable curiosity and perplexity about Mr. Elliot, already recanting the sentiment that she had so lately expressed to Mary of his being a man whom she had no wish to see. She had a great wish to see him. If he really sought to reconcile himself like a dutiful branch, he must be forgiven for having dismembered himself from the paternal tree. Anne was not animated to an equal pitch by the circumstance, but she felt she would rather see Mr. Elliot again than not, which was more than she could say for many other persons in Bath. When she was put down in Camden Place, and Lady Russell then drove to her own lodgings in Rivers Street. Okay. Alrighty. Yeah, we'll read one more chapter. I'm sure I won't regret that at all. All right. Chapter 3. Sir Walter had taken a very good house in Camden Place, a lofty, dignified situation, such as becomes a man of consequence, and both he and Elizabeth had settled there, much to their satisfaction. Anne entered it with a sinking heart, anticipating an imprisonment of many months, and anxiously saying to herself, Oh, when shall I leave you again? A degree of unexpected cordiality, however, in the welcome she received, did her good. Her father and sister were glad to see her, for the sake of showing her the house and furniture, and met her with kindness. Her making a fourth when they sat down to dinner was noticed as an advantage. Mrs. Clay was very pleasant and very smiling, but her courtesies and smiles were more of a matter of course. Anne had always felt that she would pretend what she Anne had always felt that she would pretend what was proper on her arrival, but the complacence of the others was unlooked for. They were evidently in excellent spirits, and she was soon to listen to the causes. They had no inclination to listen to her. They had no inclination to listen to her. After laying out for some complaints of being deeply regretted, after laying out for some complaints, compliments rather, after laying out for some compliments of, after laying out for some, after laying out for some compliments of being deeply regretted in their old neighborhood, which Anne could not pay, they had only a few faint inquiries to make before the talk must be all their own. Upper Cross excited no interest, Kellynch Hall very little, and it was all Bath. They had the pleasure of assuring her that Bath was more than it. They had the pleasure of assuring her. They had the pleasure of assuring her that Bath more than answered their expectations in every respect. Their house was undoubtedly the best in Camden Place. Their drawing rooms had many decided advantages over all the others which they had either seen or heard of, and the superiority was not less in the style of the fitting up, or of the taste, of the furniture. Their acquaintance was exceedingly sought after. Everybody was wanting to visit them. They had drawn back from many introductions, and still were perpetually having cards left by people on who and were still perpetually left having card and were still perpetually having cards left by people on who of whom they knew nothing. Here were funds of enjoyment. Could Anne wonder that her father and sister were happy? She might not wonder, but she must sigh that her father could feel no degradation in his change, should see nothing to regret in the duties and dignity of the resident landowner. Should see nothing to regret in the duties and dignity of the resident landowner. Should find so much to be vain of in the littleness of a town, and she must sigh and smile and wonder too as Elizabeth threw open the folding doors and walked with exultation from one drawing room to the other, boasting of their space, at the possibility of that woman who had been mistress of Kellynch Hall finding extent to be proud of between two walls, perhaps 30 feet asunder. But this was not all they had to make them happy. They had Mr. Elliot too. Anne had a great deal to hear of Mr. Elliot. He was not only pardoned, they were delighted with him. He had been in Bath about a fortnight. He had passed through Bath in November in his way to London, when the intelligence of Sir Walter's being settled there had been of course reached him, though only 24 hours in the place, but he had not been able to avail himself of it. But he had now been a fortnight in Bath, and his first object on arriving had been to leave his card in Camden Place, following it up by such assiduous endeavors to meet, and when they did meet, by such great openness of conduct, such readiness to apologize for the past, such solicitude to be received as a relative, such solicitude to be received as a relation again, that their former good understanding was completely re-established. They had not a fault to find in him. He had explained away all the appearance of neglect on his own side. It had originated in a misapprehension entirely. He had never had an idea of throwing himself off. He had feared that he was thrown off, but knew not why, and delicacy had kept him silent. Upon the hint of having spoken disrespectfully or carelessly of the family, and the family honors, he was quite indignant. He, who had ever boasted of being an Elliot, and whose feelings as to connection were only too strict to suit the unfeudal tone of the present day, he was astonished indeed, but his character and general conduct must refute it. He could refer Sir Walter to all who knew him, and certainly the pains he had been taking on this, the first opportunity of reconciliation, to be restored to the footing of a relation and heir presumptive, was a strong proof of his opinion on the subject. The circumstances of his marriage, too, were found to admit of much extenuation. The circumstances of his marriage, too, were found to admit of much extenuation. This was an article not to be entered on by himself, but a very intimate friend of his, a Colonel Wallace, a highly respectable man, perfectly the gentleman, and not an ill-looking man, Sir Walter added, who was living in very good style in Marlborough Buildings, and had, at his own particular request, been admitted to their acquaintance through Mr. Elliot, and had, at his own particular request, been admitted to their acquaintance through Mr. Elliot, had mentioned one or two things relative to the marriage which had made a material difference in the discredit of it. These sentences are not easy to just blind read to figure out where emphasis is going. Or if they are, they're beyond me. Colonel Wallace had known Mr. Elliot long, and had been well acquainted also with his wife, had perfectly understood the whole story. She was certainly not a woman of family, but well educated, accomplished, rich, and excessively in love with his friend. There had been the charm. She had sought him. Without that attraction, not all her money would have tempted Elliot, and Sir Walter was, moreover, assured of her having been a very fine woman. Here was a great deal to soften the business. A very fine woman, with a large fortune, in love with him. Sir Walter seemed to admit it as a complete apology. And though Elizabeth could not see the circumstance in quite so favorable a light, she allowed it to be a great extenuation. Mr. Elliot had called repeatedly, had dined with them once, evidently delighted by the distinction of being asked, for they gave no dinners in general, delighted, in short, by every proof of cousinly notice, in placing his whole happiness in being on intimate terms in Camden Place. Anne listened, but without quite understanding it. Large allowances, she knew, must be made for the ideas of those who spoke. She heard it all under embellishment. All that sounded extravagant or irrational in the progress of the reconciliation might have no origin but in the language of the relators. Still, however, she had the sensation of there being something more than immediately. Man, my voice is getting tired. 3 chapters was a mistake. Still, however, she had the sensation of there being something more than immediately appeared in Mr. Elliot's wishing, after an interval of so many years, to be well received by them. In a worldly view, he had nothing to gain by being on terms with Sir Walter, nothing to risk by a state of variance. In all probability, he was already the richer of the two, and the Kellynch estate would assuredly be his hereafter as the title. A sensible man? And he had looked like a very sensible man. Why should it be an object to him? She could only offer one solution. It was perhaps for Elizabeth's sake. There might really have been There might really have been a liking formerly, though convenience and accident had drawn him in a though convenience and accident had drawn him a different way, and now he could afford to please himself. He might mean to pay his address to her. Elizabeth was certainly very handsome, with well-bred, elegant manners, and her character might never have been and her character might never have been and her character might never have been penetrated by Mr. Elliot, knowing her but in public, and when very young himself. How her temper and understanding might bear the investigation of his present keener time of life was another concern, and a rather fearful one. Most earnestly did she wish that he might not be too nice or too observant if Elizabeth were his object, and that Elizabeth was disposed to believe herself so, and that her friend Mrs. Clay was encouraging the idea, seemed apparent by a glance or two between them, while Mr. Elliot's frequent visits were talked of. Anne mentioned the glimpses she had of him at Lyme, but without being much attended to. Oh, yes, perhaps it had been Mr. Elliot. They did not know. It might be him, perhaps. They could not listen to her They could not listen to her description of him. They were describing him themselves, Sir Walter especially. He did justice to his very gentlemanlike appearance, his air of elegance and fashion, his good-shaped face, his sensible eye, but at the same time must lament his being very much underhung, a defect by a defect which time seemed to have increased. Nor could he pretend to say that 10 years had not altered almost every feature for the worse. Mr. Elliot appeared to think that he, Sir Walter, was looking exactly as he had done when they last parted. But Sir Walter not been able to return to the compl- had not been able to return the compliment entirely, which had embarrassed him. He did not mean to complain. He did not mean to complain, however. Mr. Elliot was better. Mr. Elliot was better to look at than most men, and he had no objection to being seen with him anywhere. Mr. Elliot and his friends in the Marlborough Buildings were talked of the whole evening. Colonel Wallis had been so impatient to be introduced to them, and Mr. Elliot was so anxious that he should. And there was a Mrs. Wallis, at present only known to them by description, as she was in daily expectation of her confinement. But Mr. Elliot spoke of her as a most charming woman, most worthy of being known in Cardamom Place, and as soon as she was recovered, they were to be acquainted. Sir Walter thought much of Mrs. Wallis. She said she was to be an excessively pretty woman, beautiful. He longed to see her. He hoped she might make amends for the many. He hoped she might make. He hoped she might make some amends for the many very plain faces he was continually passing in the streets. The worst of Bath was the number of its plain women. He did not mean to say that there were so. He did not mean to say that there were no pretty women, but the number of the plain was out of all proportion. He had frequently observed, as he walked, that one handsome face might be followed by 30, or 5, or 30 frights, and once he had stooped in a shop in Bond Street. He had counted 87 women go by, one after another, without there being a tolerable face among them. It had been a frosty morning, to be sure, a sharp frost, which hardly one woman in a thousand could stand the test of. But still, there certainly were a dreadful multitude of ugly women in Bath, and as for the men, they were infinitely worse. Such scarecrows as the streets were full of. It was evident how little the women were used to the sight of anything tolerable by the effect which a man of decent appearance produced. He had never walked anywhere arm in arm with Colonel Wallis, who was a fine military figure, though sandy-haired, Without observing that every woman's eye was upon him, every woman's eye was sure to be upon Colonel Wallace. Modest Sir Walter. He was not allowed to escape, however. His daughter and Mrs. Clay united in hinting that Colonel Wallace's companion might not might have as good a figure as Colonel Wallace, and certainly was not sandy haired. How is Mary looking? Said Sir Walter, in the height of his good humor. The last time I saw her, she had a red nose, but I hope that may not happen every day. Oh no, that must have been quite accidental. In general, she has been in very good health and very good looks since Michaelmas. If I thought she would not tempt her, if I thought it would not tempt her to go out in sharp winds and grow coarse, I would send her a new hat and pelisse. Anne was considering whether she should venture to suggest that a gown or a cap would not be liable to any such misuse, when a knock at the door suspended everything. A knock at the door? And so late? It was 10 o'clock. Could it be Mr. Elliot? They knew he was to dine in Lansdowne Crescent. It was possible that he might stop in his way home, to ask them how they did. They could think of no one else. Mrs. Clay decidedly thought it was Mr. Elliot's knock. Mrs. Clay was right. With all the state which a butler and a footboy could give, Mr. Elliot was ushered into the room. It was the very same man, with no difference but of dress. Anne drew a little back, while the others received his compliments, and her sister his apologies for calling it so unusual an hour, but he could not be so near without wishing to know that neither she nor her friend could have taken the cold could have but he could not be so near without wishing to know that neither she nor her friend had taken cold the day before, etc., etc., which was all as which all was which was all as politely done and as politely taken as possible, but a part must follow then. Sir Walter talked of his youngest daughter. Mr. Elliot must give him leave to present Mr. Elliot must give him leave to present him to his youngest daughter. There was no occasion for remembering Mary, and Anne, smiling and blushing, very becomingly showed to Mr. Elliot the pretty features which he had by no means forgotten, and instantly saw, with amusement at his little start of surprise, that he had not been at all aware who she was. He looked completely astonished, but not more astonished than pleased. His eyes brightened, and with the most perfect alacrity he welcomed the relationship, alluded to the past, and entreated to be received as an acquaintance already. He was quite as good looking as he had appeared at Lyme, his countenance improved by speaking, and his manners were so exactly what they ought to be, so polished, so easy, so particularly agreeable, that she could compare them in excellence to only one person's manners. They were not the same, but they were perhaps equally good. He sat down with them and improved their conversation very much. There could be no doubt of his being a sensible man. 10 minutes were enough to certify that. His tone, his expressions, his choice of subject, his knowing when to stop, it was all the operation of a sensible, discerning mind. As soon as he could, he began to talk of her of Lyme, wanting to compare opinions respecting the place, but especially wanting to speak of the circumstance of their happening to be guests in the same inn at the same time, to give his own route, understand something of hers, and regret that he should have lost such an opportunity of paying his respects to her. She gave him a short account of her party and business at Lyme. His regret increased as he listened. He had spent his whole solitary evening in the room adjoining theirs, had heard voices, mirth continually, thought they must be a most delightful set of people, longed to be with them, but certainly without the smallest suspicion of his possessing the shadow of a right to introduce himself. If he had but asked who the party were, the name of Musgroves would have been enough for the name of Musgrove would have told him enough. Well, it would serve him to cu- well, it would serve to cure him of an absurd practice of never asking a question at an inn, which which he had adopted when quite a young well, it would serve to cure him of the absurd practice of never asking a question at the inn, which he had adopted when quite a young man, on the principle of it be, on the principle of its being very ungenteel to be curious. The notions of a young man of 1 or 2 and 20, said he, as to what is necessary in manners as to make him quite the thing, are more absurd, I believe, than those of any other set of beings in the world. The folly of the means which they often employ is only to be equaled by the folly of what they have in view. But he must not be addressing his reflections to Anne alone. He knew it. He was soon diffused again among the others, and it was only at intervals that he could return. And it was only at intervals that he could return to Lyme. His inquiries, however, produced at length an accounting of the scene she had been engaged there, and soon after his leaving the place. Having alluded to an accident, he must hear the whole. When he questioned, Sir Walter and Elizabeth began to question also, but the difference in their manner of doing it could not be unfelt. She could only compare Mr. Elliot to Lady Russell. She could only compare Mr. Elliot to Lady Russell in the wish of really comprehending what had passed, and in the degree of concern for what she must have suffered in witnessing it. He stayed an hour with them. The elegant little clock on the mantelpiece had struck 11 with its silver sounds, and the watchman was beginning to be heard at a distance telling the same tale, before Mr. Elliot or any of them seemed to feel that he had been there long. Anne could not have supposed it possible that her first evening in Camden Place could have passed so well. Okay. I did not see Mr. Elliot being well received. That one caught me off guard. Interesting. So, what's his role going to be in this? It was mentioned early on they had a chance encounter in Lyme near the midway point. Now he's being set up as a potential foil. There's an argument that he's going for Elizabeth, since that's who he was initially going to be engaged or set up with. But the fact that Anne considers him actually intelligent suggests that him and Elizabeth might not be an excellent match for each other. And wonders if he's going to divert attention to Anne then. I don't know. We'll see. Well, until next week, any of that watched this far, thank you for watching. Appreciate the support. See you next time.